Hey church, this week we're talking about Mark chapter 12, and I'm really glad that the Reverend Dr. Glendon Thompson, who's the senior pastor at Jarvis Street Baptist Church, will be joining us for worship on Sunday. We'll be preaching on this text. But you've provided a couple of questions through the week about this chapter, and I'd love to take an opportunity to answer them in a way that makes sense to me, and maybe we'll hear more about these questions from Dr. Thompson on Sunday as well. So the first question is actually one that came up in my home church's conversation this past Wednesday evening, and somebody in the group asked, why these details in the parable? Why does verse 1 have as many details about the work of the owner before verse 2 really begins the action of the parable? It seems maybe unnecessary, especially since we've been saying over and over again, reading Mark's gospel, that he's not one for superfluous details. He's normally a person who gets straight to the point. And the answer our group sort of arrived at was that this verse 1, really explains that this isn't just some absentee landlord who's profiting off the work of renters, but this is somebody who built the vineyard, who cares about the vineyard, and who has entrusted it to the care of others. And if we say that the owner of the vineyard is God, if that's how we're meant to understand this parable, it actually points us back to a really great image from the book of Isaiah as well. In Isaiah 5, the prophet talks about Israel as God's vineyard. The prophet writes, "My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up and cleared it of stones and planted it with the choicest vines. He built a watchtower in it and cut out a winepress as well." And a lot of those actions sound exactly like the actions that Jesus is saying in Mark's gospel this vineyard owner did. So there are tons of parallels here. We are supposed to understand that this is God doing this work. And so then God sort of asks in Isaiah 5, what more could have been done for my vineyard than I have done for it? And we can hear the exasperation of that question, that God has cared for and tended this vineyard so well. And then going back further, we might even say not just that Israel is God's vineyard, but in fact that the whole world is meant to be God's garden. In Genesis chapter 2, it says, "The Lord God planted a garden in Eden." So God has consistently been imagined as the owner of a vineyard, as the tender of vines, as the planter of gardens. And I think that's why we have some of those details provided for us, so we can draw that connection and remind ourselves that our God is a caring God, not some distant and aloof God who's abandoned us to this world, but who still cares about the things that he's invested so much time and work and love into. And our second question this week relates to that first question as well. This question is asking that in verse 9, there seems to be a lot of vengeance from the vineyard owner. But Jesus elsewhere teaches us not to seek an eye for an eye, but to turn the other cheek. And so this question is sort of asking, well, what gives? What are we supposed to do? And does God get an exception from this teaching of Jesus? And again, we can turn back to Isaiah chapter 5, that Jesus really seems to be pulling a lot out of as he teaches from this parable, as he gives the lesson from the parable as well. Because in Isaiah 5 verse 5, God plans to take away the head from the vineyard and to let the vineyard be destroyed, to break down its wall and let it be trampled, to make it a wasteland that isn't pruned or cultivated, to let it be filled with thorns and to go without rain. And Jesus actually seems to tweak the outcome a little bit. He plays with Isaiah chapter 5 because he doesn't suggest the vineyard will be destroyed by the owner at all. Rather, he suggests it's the tenants that will bear this punishment. It's not the vineyard, it's the wicked tenants who will be destroyed. The teachers of the law that have harmed what God intended for good, that will be punished, and new tenants will tend the vineyard instead. So if the vineyard is Israel, and perhaps even if the vineyard is the world, this is incredibly good news. Jesus is saying it's the people who have harmed God's creation that will bear punishment and not creation itself. And I think this is something that God reiterates again and again throughout the Old and New Testaments, that this is what God desires to happen, that all should be made right again. Jesus is pointing to himself as the last messenger, the last chance. And so we should remember that God hasn't actually sought an eye for an eye with Israel, just as the vineyard owner let so many other messengers be treated poorly and killed before his final messenger and before he finally seeks justice. God has been just as patient with Israel, just as patient with the world, not seeking vengeance every time somebody stepped a foot out of line, but really trying to bring things to an ultimate conclusion and fulfillment, which we see in Jesus. And so that's why he's saying this parable, he is the one who is the final messenger, and those who reject him, who turn him away, are really harming the vineyard most of all, and they're going to be turned away as well. And I think this whole lesson brings us back to the first sin, the origin of sin in the garden which God planted, as people tried to become like God. This was the temptation of the fruit, that if we consumed that fruit, the forbidden fruit, we would become like God, and we desired that. We wanted to see what that was like. We desired to eat that fruit, to become as God is. And this is what we see in this parable as well. The tenants, they don't want to be tenants. They want to be owners. The teachers of the law, as well, we might say, don't just want to be teachers of the law. They want to be the ones who judge Israel. And so they always judge in their own favor. And likewise, we could say that we don't just want to be us. We don't want to just be servants of God. We don't just want to be followers of Jesus. We so often want to be gods of our own. This is the sin of the parable. This is the sin of the world. And in this is the way of death. We cannot flourish as our own gods. The one true God is the source of all life, and it's only in right relationship with God, as God and us as people who bear God's image but follow in God's way. This is where life is found. We can only find life as stewards and not as owners, as teachers and not as judges, as people and not as God. That's the way that we can have any life at all. And so what Jesus warns is less of a threat than it is the central truth of all creation, that we're created for life, but life is in right relationship with God. And if we try to subvert that, we'll find instead death and suffering. And Jesus is warning people against this, that we can't have life and be God. If we try to be God, we'll find suffering and death, separation from God, who is the source of life. So I think that's what Jesus is doing in the parable. It's not that God can seek an eye for an eye and that sometimes that's the way of justice. It's more that there's a fundamental truth about the created world. And we're a part of that creation. We can't step outside of it. And so it's as we behave in the most human ways that we find life, and not as we try to become more and more God instead of people. So I hope that those answers help spur some more conversation, help spark some thoughts in your own mind, help you as you wrestle with this parable, and as we listen to Dr. Thompson on Sunday as well, that as he preaches from this text, we might be able to think more deeply about the ways that this parable speaks to our world and our church and our lives as well. I look forward to reading the rest of Mark's Gospel with you, church, and I'll see you on Sunday.